Hanoi, North Vietnam, March 1967. Soviet air defense commanders believed they had perfected the unbreakable defense. Dense networks of SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missiles, guided by fan-song radars operating across multiple frequency bands, formed an impenetrable umbrella over the most strategic targets in Southeast Asia. The missiles accelerated to Mach 3.5, climbed to 60,000 feet, and carried proximity-fused warheads that didn't need direct hits to destroy American aircraft. The North Vietnamese claimed their SAM belts had turned the sky into a kill zone where any strike package attempting penetration would be annihilated before reaching target. Soviet doctrine taught that radar-guided missiles made conventional air attacks obsolete. They were confident, they were prepared, and they were about to discover they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Because the United States Air Force created the Wild Weasels, specialized fighter crews who didn't evade enemy radars. They hunted them, July 24, 1965. Route Package 6, North Vietnam. Captains Roscoe Faubert and Richard Cairn were flying MiG-CAP Combat Air Patrol at 23,000 feet in their F-4C Phantom, call sign Leopard 2, providing cover for an F-105 Thunderchief strike force hitting ground targets near Hanoi. The altitude was deliberate, too high for most anti-aircraft artillery to reach, and North Vietnamese MiG activity had been minimal. The mission had been routine, uneventful, calm. Then the radio crackled, bluebells ringing, bluebells ringing. The cryptic code from an RB-66 electronic warfare aircraft meant one thing: a fan-song fire control radar, the guidance system for the SA-2 surface-to-air missile, was transmitting. 5 minutes later, the call repeated. Bluebells ringing. Leopard 4's pilot saw it first. A long white missile with an orange flame trail climbing vertically toward their formation at impossible speed. Less than 1 second later, the SA-2 detonated. The shockwave flipped Leopard 2 inverted. Both crew members ejected seconds before the aircraft disintegrated in midair. The first American aircraft had been shot down by a surface-to-air missile in the Vietnam War, but it would not be the last. The SA-2 guideline was not a surprise to American intelligence. It had already brought down Francis Gary Powers in a CIA U-2 over the Soviet Union in 1960. Another U-2 was destroyed during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The missile had a range of 25 miles, accelerated to Mach 3.5, and was deadly against aircraft at medium and high altitudes. By April 1965, U-2 reconnaissance photography revealed new installations under construction near Hanoi, revetted emplacements laid out in the distinctive six-pointed Star of David pattern characteristic of SA-2 sites, with facilities for radar vans in the center and missile launchers positioned at the points of the star. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara refused permission to strike the sites, fearing Soviet technicians might be killed and the conflict would escalate. John McNaughton, Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, dismissed the threat entirely. You don't think the North Vietnamese are going to use them? Putting them in is just a political ploy by the Russians to appease Hanoi. McNaughton's assumption was discredited 76 days later when Leopard 2 fell from the sky. By August 1965, more than 100 SAM sites ringed Hanoi and extended south to cover military and industrial areas as far as Vinh. The North Vietnamese air defense network, trained by Soviet advisors, equipped with the latest radar-guided missiles, and protected by hundreds of anti-aircraft artillery batteries, had become the most lethal integrated air defense system American pilots had ever faced. And the United States Air Force had no dedicated capability to suppress it. August 13, 1965. The Pentagon, Washington, D.C. General John P. McConnell, Air Force Chief of Staff, convened a special task force under Brigadier General K.C. Dempster with one directive: find a way to counter the SAM threat. The recommendations were radical: modify a small number of fighters with electronic equipment to enable them to find active SAM sites and mark them for destruction by accompanying strike aircraft. Develop a missile that could be fired from a fighter and home on radar emissions. Develop jamming equipment to counter SAM radars. And create a radar homing and warning capability that would provide crews warning that a SAM radar was tracking them and give some indication of its location. The program was given a name that evoked the covert World War II Ferret. Missions flown to locate enemy radars: Wild Weasel. 4 F-100F Super Sabres 2-seat trainers were selected as the initial platform. The rear cockpit was stripped of flight controls and filled with off-the-shelf electronic equipment: the Vector Homing and Warning System, the IR-133 Panoramic Scan Receiver, and the WR-300 Receiver. The Vector provided 360-degree warning of S, C, and X-band radar signals, the frequency bands used by early warning radars, gun-directing radars, and surface-to-air missile systems. Threats were displayed on a small circular CRT screen with a strobe indicating direction. The IR-133 received radar pulses through antennas mounted symmetrically around the nose of the aircraft. By analyzing frequency and pulse repetition rate, the electronic warfare officer in the back seat could determine whether the signal came from a SAM site anti-aircraft battery or early warning radar, and whether that radar was in search, tracking, launch, or guidance mode. The WR-300 monitored the SA-2's guidance frequency. When it detected the characteristic power shift indicating missile launch, a bright red launch light illuminated in the cockpit. The crew concept was simple. The electronic warfare officer would concentrate on identifying and locating threat radars while the pilot flew the aircraft, searched visually for SAM sites, and took evasive action. Testing at Eglin Air Force Base, Florida, was completed on November 19, 1965. The very next day, just 4 months after Leopard 2 was shot down, the 4 modified F-100F aircraft and the Wild Weasel test team departed for Southeast Asia. Combat operations in theater would provide the ultimate test of equipment and tactics. The Wild Weasel crews arrived at Korat Royal Thai Air Force Base in Thailand on November 28, 1965. Their mission was unprecedented. Fly deliberately into the most heavily defended airspace in North Vietnam, allow enemy radar operators to track them, locate the SAM sites electronically, visually acquire the camouflaged installations, mark them with rockets, and direct accompanying F-105 Thunderchief strike aircraft to destroy them. They would go in ahead of the main strike force, first in. And they would remain behind after the bombers departed to suppress any radars that reactivated. Last out, the motto that would define the mission for the next 5 decades was born in those first sorties. First in, last out. Over the next 60 days, Wild Weasel crews flew 112 combat sorties, 44 Iron Hand strikes against SAM sites, and 32 electronic intelligence missions, totaling nearly 250 hours. The results were immediate. On December 20, 1965, Captains Al Lam and Jack Donovan destroyed a SAM site during a Rolling Thunder strike on the rail yard at Yen Bai, 75 miles northwest of Hanoi. It was the first Wild Weasel success, but it came at a cost. That same day, Captain John Pitchford and Captain Robert Trier were flying an Iron Hand mission southeast of Kep Airfield when their F-100F's onboard electronics indicated they were passing directly over an active SAM site. Pitchford climbed abruptly, turned hard right, rolled level, and fired his marking rockets. Then a 37 anti-aircraft shell tore through the aircraft's afterburner. "I am hit," Pitchford transmitted. Pieces began falling from the aircraft. The canopy separated. One parachute opened. The F-100F pitched over into the clouds and disappeared. Pitchford became the first Wild Weasel prisoner of war. He would spend more than 7 years in North Vietnamese prisons before returning home in 1973. Trier was killed fighting his captors. His remains were not returned until November 3, 1982. The Wild Weasels had proven radar homing to counter the SAM threat was possible, but the mission was as dangerous as it was revolutionary. The F-100F had a critical limitation: it was too slow. Wild Weasels flew at 400 knots. The F-105 Thunderchiefs they escorted preferred 500 knots. The F-105 pilots had to weave constantly to avoid overtaking the Weasels ahead of them. The solution was obvious: make the F-105 itself the Wild Weasel platform. In May 1966, the first 11 F-105F Thunderchiefs 2-seat trainer variants modified for the Wild Weasel role arrived at Korat. Another 7 deployed to the 355th Tactical Fighter Wing at Takli Air Base in July. The F-105F Thud was fast, sturdy. And it carried the AGM-45 Shrike missile, a weapon that homed directly on enemy radar emissions. This was the classic Wild Weasel combination. The F-105F replaced the F-100F, which flew its last Wild Weasel mission in July 1966. But the Air Force was not adding Wild Weasels as fast as the North Vietnamese were adding SAMs. By August 1966, more than 100 SAM sites were operational. At first clustered around Hanoi, coverage soon extended south to Vinh and beyond. And all 7 F-105F Weasels at Takli were shot down within 6 weeks of arrival. The saying among Thud pilots was dark and accurate: by your 66th mission you'll have been shot down twice and picked up once. Major Leo K. Thorsness led the Wild Weasels at Takli. He described the mission in stark terms: in essence, we would go in high enough to let somebody shoot at us and low enough to go down and get them. The tactic was deliberate: use the aircraft itself as bait. A 4-ship Wild Weasel flight would accompany F-105D fighter bombers on strikes into North Vietnam. Ideally, all 4 aircraft would be full-up Weasels with complete electronic equipment suites, but there were never enough. Typically, the element leaders flying in the number 1 and number 3 positions were F-105F Weasels with standard F-105DS in the wing positions. All Weasel missions were into high-threat areas. That's where the SAMs were. The Weasels went in several minutes ahead of the main strike force to clear a path. If the site operators turned on their tracking radar or fired a missile, the Weasels attacked. Each SAM site had 5 or 6 launchers situated in a 6-pointed star pattern around a 40-foot ring. The missiles were guided by a Fan Song radar housed in a van in the center of the ring. The North Vietnamese could pack up the entire site and have it operational in a different location in just 6 hours. The sites were usually well camouflaged, hidden among trees or small villages. Visual acquisition was extremely difficult, even after the onboard electronics indicated overflight. But when the Wild Weasel aircraft was painted by the beam from the Fan Song radar, the crew heard a distinctive sound crackling in their headsets. They called it the rattlesnake. The Fan Song needed approximately 75 seconds to acquire the target and fire the missile. That gave the Weasels time to home on the radar signal and shoot first. The AGM-45 Shrike anti-radiation missile was a revolution in air-to-ground warfare. It homed passively on enemy radar emissions. Once launched, the missile required no further input from the aircrew. It followed the radar beam back to its source and detonated, but it had a critical limitation: range. The SA-2 guideline had an effective range against fighters of 17 miles. The Shrike had a range of only 8 miles. The Weasels were consistently outgunned by 10 miles. Major Thorsness and his electronic warfare officer, Captain Harold Harry Johnson, found the solution. They called it the Shrike Toss. Climb to 35,000 feet, plug in the afterburner, pull the nose up to 45 degrees, nearly stalled out. At the apex of the climb, release the Shrike. Gravity and momentum extended the missile's effective range to 35 miles. The first time they pulled it off was, in Thorsness's words, a celebration day. But firing the Shrike was only half the problem. The other half was surviving the SA-2 coming up to meet them. The first stage booster of the SA-2 created a massive dust storm on the ground when it launched. If you were looking in the right direction, you knew a SAM was airborne and hunting. After the booster dropped away, the missile's internal rocket motor ignited, accelerating it to Mach 3.5. If you could see the SAM, you could usually escape it. The missile had stubby wings and traveled at extreme speed, which meant it couldn't turn well. Weasel pilots took it on like another aircraft, forcing it into a committed trajectory, then outturning it at the last second. The tactic became legendary: the SAM break. At the warning cry, "Take it down," the Wild Weasel dove at high speed past the rising missile, then pulled up sharply and changed direction. Sometimes descending caused the SAM's tracking radar to lose lock. Sometimes the missile overshot harmlessly. If those didn't work, the pilot still had airspeed, lots of it, to make a break at the last moment and force the missile to miss. Captain Jerry Hoblet at Tackley developed another innovation: split the 4-ship flight into 2 elements, one on the left side ahead of the strike force and one on the right. This provided broader radar coverage across the ingress route. It also increased risk. North Vietnamese SAM operators learned to fire missiles in groups of 3, creating what the Weasels called Dr. Pepper attacks, with missiles incoming simultaneously from 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and 4 o'clock. Wild Weasel crews dodged multiple Mach 3 missiles while simultaneously homing on the radars, guiding them and launching Shrikes in return, and they were not only first in, they were last out. Their presence intimidated SAM operators, forcing them to turn off radars. To maintain suppression, some Weasels remained as a rear guard until the last strike aircraft departed. In late 1967, the F-105FS were upgraded to F-105G configuration with improved avionics, and they received a better weapon, the AGM-78 Standard Arm. The Standard was faster than the Shrike, had almost 4 times its range, over 30 miles, and carried a larger warhead. From March 1968 forward, the Standard Arm steadily replaced the Shrike as the primary Wild Weasel weapon. But in March 1968, President Lyndon Johnson halted bombing of North Vietnam above the 20th parallel as part of peace negotiations. Most Wild Weasels pulled out of Southeast Asia. Those that remained were consolidated into a single squadron at Korat. For the next 4 years, Wild Weasel operations were restricted by protective reaction rules of engagement. Weasels could not engage a SAM site until the Fan Song radar actively tracked them, or an RF-4C reconnaissance aircraft. The North Vietnamese adapted. They tracked American flights with long-range radars the Weasels couldn't detect. The Fan Song would wait until the last possible moment to activate, giving the SAM crew maximum advantage and the Weasels minimal warning. In one 4-month period, over 200 SAMs were launched at U.S. aircraft. Then in May 1972, President Richard Nixon ordered the resumption of full-scale bombing of North Vietnam. Operation Linebacker had begun. Wild Weasels at Koret were reinforced by a squadron from McConnell Air Force Base, Kansas, raising the number of F-105GS in theater to 28. A new Wild Weasel variant also arrived, the F-4C Phantom. The F-4C Weasel had been developed at the same time as the F-105 variant, with squadrons based in Germany and at Kadena Air Base, Okinawa. The Kadena Squadron deployed to Koret in October 1972. But airframe space limitations meant the F-4C Weasel could only carry Shrikes, not the longer-range Standard Arm. By the time Linebacker began, North Vietnam had approximately 30 SAM sites operational. During Linebacker, they fired 4,244 missiles at American aircraft. Wild Weasels teamed with F-4E fighter bombers to systematically destroy SAM sites, radar vans, and launchers using cluster bombs, Shrikes, and Standard Arms. The final Wild Weasel mission in Vietnam came in December 1972 during Linebacker II, the intensive 11-day bombing campaign against Hanoi. Wild Weasels escorted B-52 Stratofortresses through the heaviest air defenses in the history of warfare, suppressing SAM sites and allowing the bombers to destroy strategic targets that forced North Vietnam back to the negotiating table. The effectiveness of North Vietnamese SAM operators, measured by aircraft shot down per missile fired, had declined from 5.7% in 1965 to less than 1% in 1968. The Wild Weasels had broken the unbreakable defense. By the end of the Vietnam War, all models of the F-105 Thunderchief had taken terrible losses. 46 F-105 Wild Weasels and 2 F-100F Wild Weasels were lost in combat. Those not shot down were simply wearing out. In 1978, the Air Force introduced the next-generation Wild Weasel, the F-4G Phantom II. The F-4G was a modified version of the F-4E, extensively re-engineered for the suppression of enemy air defenses mission. 52 AN APR-38 radar warning receiver antennas were embedded in the aircraft's skin, providing 360-degree coverage across all radar frequency bands. Inside the rear cockpit, the electronic warfare officer operated the APR-47 radar homing and warning system, a sophisticated suite that automatically detected, identified, prioritized, and displayed up to 15 different threat emitters simultaneously on digital screens. The system told the crew not only what type of radar was tracking them, but precisely where it was located. And the F-4G could employ both the AGM-78 Standard Arm and the new AGM-88 HARM, high-speed anti-radiation missile. The AGM-88 HARM was a quantum leap in lethality. Powered by a thiokol dual-thrust solid rocket motor, the HARM accelerated to Mach 2+ and had a range exceeding 30 miles. Its seeker head locked onto enemy radar emissions and critically retained the last known position of the emitter even if the radar shut down. Enemy operators faced an impossible choice: keep the radar on and be destroyed, or shut down and go blind. Either way, the air defense system was neutralized. The F-4G remained in service for 20 years and became the most capable defense suppression aircraft in the world. And on January 17, 1991, it would prove its value in the opening hours of Operation Desert Storm. January 17, 1991, 2:20 am local time, Iraqi airspace. The opening shots of Operation Desert Storm were fired in pursuit of defense suppression. Task Force Normandy, a strike package of 12 helicopters, 3 MH-53J Pave-Lows and 9 AH-64 Apache gunships, infiltrated deep into Iraq with a single mission: destroy 2 early warning radar sites. The MH-53JS, equipped with advanced navigation systems, guided the Apache to the targets through total darkness. At precisely 2:38 a.m., the Apache opened fire with Hellfire missiles and 30 chain guns. Both radar sites were obliterated. A hole had been torn in the Iraqi integrated air defense system. The Kari network and coalition strike aircraft poured through it. Iraq possessed one of the most sophisticated air defense networks outside the Soviet Union. The Kari system, designed by French engineers and built with Soviet equipment, integrated early warning radars, surface-to-air missile batteries, anti-aircraft artillery, and interceptor aircraft into a centralized command and control network. Saddam Hussein's military-operated SA-2, SA-3, SA-6, SA-8, and Roland surface-to-air missile systems, supported by thousands of radar-guided and optically aimed anti-aircraft guns. On paper, the defenses protecting Baghdad and southern Iraq were impenetrable. Coalition air planners knew better. Phase II of the Desert Storm air campaign had one objective: decimate the southern Iraqi air defense network within 48 hours of the start of hostilities. The mission relied on 3 elements: stealth aircraft to destroy command and control nodes, electronic warfare aircraft to jam enemy radars, and wild weasels to hunt and kill SAM sites. F-4G Wild Weasels led the way. 60 F-4G aircraft deployed to the theater for Desert Storm, operating from bases in Saudi Arabia and Turkey. They flew ahead of strike packages, carrying AGM-88 HARM missiles on multiple launch rails. Some missions employed preemptive HARM launches, firing missiles at known SAM sites before those radars even activated, forcing Iraqi operators to shut down or be destroyed. The tactic was devastatingly effective. Iraqi air defense commanders quickly realized that activating a radar meant death. SA-6 gainful batteries and roll-in systems that had been considered mobile and survivable were being hunted faster than they could relocate. Crews began shutting down radars entirely to survive, which meant they couldn't guide missiles, couldn't track aircraft, couldn't defend their airspace. The Wild Weasels had turned Iraq's strength into its fatal weakness. Within the first 48 hours of Desert Storm, the coalition achieved its goal: significant degradation of the Qari network, including destruction of all air defenses in southern Iraq. Although the Iraqis replaced many destroyed radars and brought some command centers back online, they did so in an uncoordinated, piecemeal manner. And the coalition continued bombing any site that reactivated. Combined with the failure of Iraq's air force to contest coalition air superiority, the result was absolute. The coalition owned the skies over Iraq from nearly the outset of the conflict. F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighters struck targets in downtown Baghdad with impunity. B-52 Stratofortresses carpet-bombed Republican Guard divisions. F-15E Strike Eagles conducted armed reconnaissance missions at will. All because the Wild Weasels had cleared the way. By the time the ground war began on February 24, 1991, coalition aircraft had flown over 30,000 sorties with remarkably low losses. The suppression of enemy air defenses, the mission pioneered by Wild Weasel crews over North Vietnam 26 years earlier, had become the key that unlocked every precision bombing campaign, every stealth strike, and every air superiority mission of the modern era. The F-4G Wild Weasel was retired in 1996. But the mission did not end. The Wild Weasel mission transitioned to specially trained F-16CJ Fighting Falcon crews, carrying on the tradition established by the F-100s and F-105s over North Vietnam. The F-16CJ carried the AN/ASQ-213 HARM targeting system, a podded sensor that detected and geolocated enemy radars with precision. Armed with AGM-88 HARM missiles, F-16CJ pilots could engage threats from standoff ranges while maintaining high speed and maneuverability. F-16CJs flew seed missions during Operation Allied Force over Serbia in 1999, Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, and Operation Odyssey Dawn over Libya in 2011. In each conflict, the Wild Weasel mission remained the same: find the radars, suppress the air defenses, and clear the way for the strike packages behind them. First in, last out. Today, the Wild Weasel mission is flown by FA Lightning II and FA-18G Growler crews. The F-35's advanced sensor fusion and stealth characteristics allow it to detect and engage air defense systems while remaining undetected. The EA-18G Growler combines electronic attack jamming with HARM missiles, providing both non-lethal and lethal suppression of enemy air defenses. But the doctrine remains unchanged. Air superiority is impossible without suppression of enemy air defenses. And suppression is impossible without crews willing to fly deliberately into the most lethal threat environments on Earth. 2 Wild Weasel pilots from the Vietnam War were awarded the Medal of Honor, the United States' highest military decoration for valor in combat. Captain Merlin H. Dethlefsen, March 10, 1967. Dethlefsen was leading the second element of a Wild Weasel flight from Takli, escorting a large strike force against the Thai Nguyen Iron and Steel Works north of Hanoi. When the flight leader was shot down, Dethlefsen assumed command. His F-105F was hit numerous times by anti-aircraft fire and sustained severe damage, hydraulic systems failing, flight controls barely responsive. Dethlefsen did not abort. He made 5 separate passes against the air defenses, protecting the target, suppressing SAM sites, and destroying at least 1 radar installation. He remained in the target area for 10 minutes, an eternity under intense flak barrage, allowing the strike force to hit the steel works and egress safely. Only then did Dethlefsen turn for home, nursing his crippled thud back to Thailand. Major Leo K. Thorsness. April 19, 1967. Thorsness was leading a Wild Weasel flight from Takli, escorting a strike force bound for the North Vietnamese military complex at Xuan Mai in the Red River Delta. What followed became known as the Day Thorsness and his EWO, Captain Harold Johnson, took on most of North Vietnam. They engaged MiGs, SAMs, and anti-aircraft guns simultaneously. Thorsness shot down a MiG-17 with his 20mm cannon. Gun camera footage suggests he destroyed another MiG, but the camera ran out of film before confirmation. After expending their Shrikes and cluster bombs, Thorsness and Johnson refueled from a tanker and returned to the area to fly cover for rescue helicopters attempting to recover down aircrews, armed only with their cannon. They remained on station fighting off threats until their fuel reached emergency reserves. Thorsness received the Medal of Honor. Johnson was awarded the Air Force Cross. 11 days later, on their 93rd mission, they were shot down and captured. Both men spent the rest of the war as prisoners over 6 years in North Vietnamese prisons. The Wild Weasel mission exacted a brutal toll. In Vietnam, 46 F-105 Wild Weasels and 2 F-100F Wild Weasels were lost in combat. 15 Wild Weasel crews were awarded the Air Force Cross, the second highest U.S. military decoration for valor. The losses reflected the mission's nature. Wild Weasels flew deliberately into the most heavily defended airspace, using themselves as bait to bring up enemy radars. The North Vietnamese knew the Weasels were coming, they knew what the Weasels were hunting, and they positioned anti-aircraft artillery around SAM sites specifically to kill the hunters. SAMs were not effective below 3,000 feet. So when Wild Weasels dove to evade missiles, they entered the lethal envelope of radar-guided 57 and 85 anti-aircraft guns. Captain John Pitchford and Captain Robert Trier, lost on December 20, 1965, were the first Wild Weasel casualties. They would not be the last, but there is another number that cannot be quantified. How many American airmen survived the war because Wild Weasels suppressed the SAMs? How many strike packages reached their targets because Weasel crews cleared the path? How many lives were saved because enemy radar operators shut down rather than face a harm missile screaming toward them at Mach 2? A Soviet general who served with North Vietnamese Air Defense Forces later admitted they were provided with 98 SAM systems and 7,500 missiles during the war. They finished with 45 systems and 2,300 missiles remaining. The rest had been destroyed or expended. The Wild Weasels had systematically dismantled what Soviet Doctrine claimed was an unbreakable defense. The Wild Weasel mission established a doctrine that remains foundational to modern air warfare. Suppression of enemy air defenses is not optional, it is the prerequisite for every other air operation. Without SCAD, strike aircraft cannot reach their targets. Without SCAD, air superiority is impossible. Without SCAD, modern precision warfare cannot be conducted. The Wild Weasels proved that air defenses, no matter how sophisticated, no matter how densely networked, have a vulnerability. The radars that make them effective also make them targetable, and once targeted, they can be destroyed. The AGM-88 HARM evolved through multiple variants. The AGM-88 EAARGM Advanced Anti-Radiation Guided Missile added millimeter-wave radar for terminal guidance, satellite navigation, and the ability to image the target seconds before impact and transmit that image via data link. Even if the enemy radar shut down, the HARM would remember its last known location, navigate there autonomously, and use its active radar to find and destroy the target. There was no escape. The only winning move for an air defense operator facing Wild Weasels was not to turn on the radar at all, which meant the air defense system was already defeated. March 1967, over North Vietnam. Soviet air defense advisors had watched American strike packages penetrate defenses they believed were impenetrable. They had watched SAM batteries go silent rather than risk destruction. They had watched the Fan Song radars, the backbone of the SA-2 system, become the very things that doomed the sites they were meant to protect. The North Vietnamese fired thousands of missiles and claimed dozens of aircraft, but the cost was unsustainable, and the psychological effect was devastating. In declassified Soviet assessments written after the war, air defense analysts admitted their doctrine had been blind to seed tactics. The fundamental assumption that radar-guided missiles made conventional air attack obsolete had been proven catastrophically wrong, not because the missiles weren't lethal, they were, but because the Americans had created a counter the Soviets never anticipated. Crews willing to fly directly toward the radars bait them into activating, and then kill them with anti-radiation missiles before the SAM launch sequence could complete. The Wild Weasels had turned the air defense network's greatest strength, its radars, into its fatal weakness. Operation Desert Storm validated the doctrine on a massive scale. Operation Allied Force over Serbia in 1999 reinforced it. Operations Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom proved it again. And today, as potential adversaries build integrated air defense systems with advanced radars, long-range missiles, and network command and control, the Wild Weasel mission remains as critical as it was in 1965. Because no matter how advanced the air defense system, it still requires radars to see, and those radars can be hunted. The enemy thought air defenses were unbreakable. They believed radar-guided missiles had made strike aviation obsolete. They were confident their SAM networks had turned the sky into an impenetrable kill zone, until the Wild Weasels proved them wrong. First in, last out, hunting every radar, breaking every defense. Subscribe to Classified Warfare for more declassified breakthroughs, intelligence victories, and Cold War technologies that shifted the global balance of power.